As COVID cases and deaths continue to drop in the United States, the inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 is heating up. This week, President Biden ordered a 90-day investigation into whether the virus could have come out of a lab in Wuhan, China. And we learned that several lab researchers in Wuhan were hospitalized in November 2019, earlier than Chinese officials had revealed. Joining us now, the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Texas Congressman Michael McCaul. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. So you conducted your own investigation into the pandemic's origins on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and your committee was just briefed on this last week. Based on what you've seen, do you think it's more likely than not that the coronavirus emerged naturally or from a lab accident?
You know, I do think it's more likely than not it emerged out of the lab, most likely accidentally. For several reasons. And first of all, Jake, let me say this is the worst cover-up in human history that we've seen, resulting in 3.5 million deaths, creating economic devastation around the globe. As you mentioned, though, it was just declassified that 3 of the researchers were actually hospitalized in November of 2019 with flu-like symptoms consistent with COVID. That was suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party. Since that time in December, they silenced and detained the doctors who were reporting a SARS-like virus, which under international health regulations had to be reported within 24 hours. They went and destroyed lab samples. They wouldn't admit it was human to human. And then working with the WHO, failed to report to the world that we had a local epidemic that was now going into a global pandemic. So time and time again, we're seeing this cover-up. A couple more facts here, that there were 2 State Department cables in 2018 that called into question the safety protocols at that lab. And let's not forget, in 2004, with SARS virus, they accidentally leaked the SARS virus from that lab in 2004. They were studying corona-like viruses from bats, genetically mutating them, and then trying to develop a vaccine for what would be a next wave of a SARS-like virus, almost precisely what COVID-19 is.
So let me ask you, President Biden has ordered this 90-day review by the intelligence community to see what they think. If they conclude the same thing that you have, and there's no reason to think that they wouldn't, what should the world do? What should President Biden do?
Well, I'm glad the president finally has done this. It's long overdue. I think because they have destroyed everything at the lab, it could be very inconclusive. We have signals intelligence and human and other forms of intelligence, but it may not be 100%. But I think saying it's more likely than not is probably the right answer here. My response to this whole thing is supply chain. We need to pull our supply chain out of the region, that being medical supply, rare earth mineral supply, and a bill that's going through Congress right now, bipartisan, I'm working on, the Chips for America Act, advanced semiconductor chips, which are the brains and everything from your iPhone to the F-35. If we can pull these chains out of China, it will hurt them economically, and that would be very punitive in nature.
I want to ask you about this pressing life or death issue in Afghanistan right now that you and I have talked about. Thousands of Afghans who helped U.S. troops could be, and in all likelihood will be, slaughtered by the Taliban once U.S. service members withdraw completely. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, says that, quote, there are plans being developed very, very rapidly, unquote, to evacuate them. The head of the nonprofit group No One Left Behind, who you and I both know, he says that these Afghans and their families should be immediately evacuated to Guam. And after they're safe in Guam, the U.S. can deal with their visas, et cetera. Do you support that idea?
Well, I do think they need to be protected. General Milley said that, we need to keep our promises here. We have a moral responsibility and obligation to protect them. Who are these people? There are about 18,000 of them that have applied for special immigrant visas because they served with our special forces, with our troops in Afghanistan. The interpreters put their lives on the line. Our guys couldn't have done the job without them. And, the old saying, no man left behind, no one left behind organization. It's a fine organization with special operators who have worked with these people for us to leave them behind only to be slaughtered by the Taliban, which is looking more and more like what's going to happen here, would really be unconscionable. So when the State Department says, oh, it's going to take a year or two to process these visas, and remember, that's 18. There are probably about 50,000 of them. We can't leave them. As the military is talking about withdrawing in July, they're going to withdraw earlier than we anticipated, and that's when they're going to be in the bullseye and the target of the Taliban.
Yeah.
I think we could easily, and General Milley has said this, and General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, has said that they have plans, contingency plans underway to evacuate them. They have the capability to evacuate them out of the United States or Afghanistan. Where that is, that's really their choice to make. But I believe if they don't, because what you're seeing right now is a spring offensive by the Taliban, taking over northern and southern parts, taking over bases that have been abandoned. And it's a matter of time before I think the entire country gets overrun by the Taliban. And I really, Jake, worry very much about the safety and security of our embassy itself. I don't want to see another Saigon go down like we saw in Vietnam. Same thing happened in Afghanistan. And lastly, the women left behind, we're already seeing what they're doing to them in the schools and how they're going to degrade women and little girls in Afghanistan. I think the decision made, the president made this decision, but I don't think they were really prepared for the aftermath and what is necessary, both from a human refugee standpoint and from a counterterrorism mission standpoint.
Yeah. At home, let me ask you, the Texas Senate just voted this morning to pass a sweeping new bill restricting voting rights. A draft bill would ban drive-through voting. It would stop local officials from mailing ballots to all voters. It also would make it easier for judges to overturn an election without requiring evidence that fraud changed the race's outcome. This is not your legislation, but you are a Texas Republican. What do you say to people who look at what's going on with this kind of law and say Republicans are trying to make it harder to vote because they can't win the battle of ideas ultimately, so they're just trying to, for instance, make it tougher for Black Americans to do soul to the polls voting by saying you can only do voting on Sundays after 1 p.m. I mean, that's how it looks to millions of people.
Right. And this, as I understand, passed at 6 a.m. I haven't had a chance to look at it or really comment. I know it's going to a conference committee. There are a couple of fundamentals here, though, that I think most Americans do agree with, and that is asking for an ID. When someone votes, I don't believe that's voter suppression. I think, 70% of Americans agree with that idea. And then the idea of verifying signatures, I think, is very important as well. I think what the Republicans here would tell you is that they're trying to make sure that the person voting is the person on paper, so it's a legitimate vote devoid of fraud. Now, we can debate how much fraud occurred in the last election, and Democrats have claimed fraud have happened in the previous elections. But one thing that's pretty clear to me, Jake, is that a lot of the American people seem to have lost faith in our government. They've lost faith in our elections. That we need to restore. And I think if we can take measures to take fraud out of the system or any potential for fraud. Now, COVID was a very different circumstance where, you had different voting measures and longer periods of time. And I'm all for longer early voting times, but I'm also for counting the votes during early voting. So you're not waiting a month or two after the election to see who actually won it.
But Congressman, I mean, Texas had a very successful, very clean election, and Republicans did really, really well. You won a bunch of congressional districts that Democrats thought they were going to win. The Houston Chronicle reports there are only 43 pending voter fraud charges in Texas. Just to repeat that for our viewers, not 43,000, not 4,300, 43, and only one is from the 2020 election. This again. I don't disagree with what you're saying about polls and the American people supporting making sure that there isn't fraud, but this goes beyond that. This is, I mean, why would the legislators, not you, why would those legislators make it easier for a judge to throw out election without anyone having to prove that there's fraud?
Yeah, and of course, the 70 cases and the presidential got thrown out as well. But I think the intent, and I'm not in the state legislature, is to restore confidence in the elections that fraud isn't taking place. Now, you make a good point. I'm a federal prosecutor in a court of law. That hasn't really been borne to bear. This may be more of an optics issue, restoring confidence with the American people. And in my state, who actually do believe there was tremendous fraud. In any event, I think there are small measures we can take, whether it's voter ID or signature verification, that I think would give the American people more trust in our elections, which, by the way, the Russians didn't give us much confidence either, or what the Chinese tried to do either in our elections.